Eli Stansel here. Thought I'd give you a little bit of a rundown of the cultural site survey that was done for the DOT at the 278, the Stanton Springs exit off I-20. So let's take a look at that and some of the things that are involved.
Just a quick pause as we start the video. If you believe in helping us out with keeping Morgan County rural, please click on the links down below and consider supporting Morgan County Land, Sky, and Water.
So this is the firm that put it in, Edwards Pittman, and it just covers State Route 12, 278, Willow Springs, Church Road, Shire Parkway, Walton, Newton counties, and it deals around the exit there on Interstate 20. So this is the table of contents that goes with the report, and what you'll see is it figures, tables, keywords, kind of the beginning of it. If you watched my other video that talked about what to expect from a cultural site survey, a lot of this stuff is familiar to you. You'll see in Chapter 2, pages 5 through the mid-50s, they're just setting up the context. All they're doing is kind of painting a picture of the area, talking about what was there, what happened in the pre-contact period, what would be called, paleohistoric, up through the historic period, which is essentially recorded European contact going forward. Talk about some of the land use, and then they'll finally get in over in the method side, talking about what they looked at in the field and how they looked at it, what they found, and then how they evaluated what should be preserved and what should not be recommended for preservation according to the National Historic Registry. Here on this screen, what you will see is this is the area that the survey is concerned with. So here's Interstate 20, Stanton Springs exit. Here's that Stanton Springs South with Meta and that sort of stuff down there. And then, of course, Ravian would end up going over in this area. So this doesn't even look at any of that. This is just dealing with the area within this kind of dashed yellow and black line, nothing outside of that. They will talk about setting up the Mississippian period. That's 85 or 81,000 through 1540, kind of through DeSoto's possible contact in the area. And what they'll speak to is just kind of how things developed. We don't know a whole lot about the culture. We know a little bit. Closest experience you can probably have to understand in the Mississippian period would be to go to the Old Muggy Indian Mountains in Macon. That would be something that would have happened in the Mississippian period. Back in 2000, the Southeastern Archaeological Services did some work around Reynolds Plantation in Lake Oconee. There's a period called Lamar at some Lamar farmsteads, and tried to determine what they could find out, doing a little work with early to middle Mississippian research. And in this area is what's called the Washington Slope, and that is essentially kind of a geographic reference to an area that's Monroe South. So that is what they refer to when they talk about the area of the Washington Slope. It's kind of that area. As they look through that, what they talk about is there may be some times that settlements didn't happen right next to a creek, that it looks like there are times they may have settled on some high ground. So we've got both those areas present in the Ravian Site, but this particular research doesn't go into looking at that. It's mainly just concerned to that one area along the interstate. Talks about the Washington Slope District contained 154 historic period American Indian sites. That's kind of the recorded, the newer stuff. It says no historic Indian or proto-historic sites are located within 1 kilometer of the survey area. So that original area kind of drew out that you saw on the map. They said there was no historic Indian or proto-historic sites located within 1 kilometer of that. Now the setup, as they're talking about the history of the area, they talk a couple of paragraphs here. And this is where, if you saw my prior video, I vented my frustration a bit, because when they write these historical narratives about an area, they do not go and do primary research. They generally take just some local history or what they can find with a brief visit to the library with a general history of the area, and they just kind of copy and paste that in their own words in here to say this is the historical context of the area. They don't dig into any primary research. Let me call out 2 paragraphs that occur on the same page in the report that essentially provide alternate information. One of the paragraphs says prior to 1805, the land that would later form Newton and Walton counties near the survey area was entirely Muskogee Creek land that would be ceded to the United States through the first of two treaties. One of those, the Treaty of Washington, signed on November 14th, 1805. So they do a good job in quoting that the Treaty of Washington, when it happened, and that was entirely what would be called Muskogee land, commonly called the Creeks. And that is true. Pretty much the area from present-day Atlanta south and kind of going up the Chattahoochee on both sides was all Muskogee Creek. So that's completely appropriate and right. A mere paragraph later in the report, they say Social Circle was incorporated in 1831 at the intersection of the Hightower Trail, a major Indian path, and Rouge Road, an early pioneer trail created by the original land surveyors, which followed an existing Cherokee trail. Now, we just learned in the paragraph prior that this was entirely Muskogee Creek. It was not Cherokee, so there's no Cherokee trail that exists here. Now, there's no doubt that there were probably some Cherokees that moved in and used the trail. This was not a Cherokee cut trail. This was a Native American trail. It belonged in Muskogee Creek land. The biggest trail through here was obviously the Hightower, the Etowah Trail, that came across the Appalachia high shoals, made its way right along the edge of the Ravian Site there in what is now still called Hightower. Turns off at Unity Store and goes up to Social Circle. Yes, there's a branch out of Social Circle that will turn and take you toward one of the several shallow fords on the Chattahoochee, Shallowford. One that will take you down toward the Stone Mountain, take you to the shallow ford down there, one that will take you to Standing Peachtree, which is around Bolton. Anyway, there's a number of trails that lead to the Chattahoochee River and eventually make the way over to the Hightower River, which is now called the Etowah River. But here, just a couple of paragraphs apart, they say this is a Cherokee trail. You don't have a Cherokee trail in Creek Indian country. That just does not happen. Just a pure example of we just cut and paste to go ahead and fill the report out. Okay. What you're looking at here is the actual text, the actual copy of the Treaty of Washington, 1805. This is the second page where they go into Article 2 and Article 3. That's what it looks like handwritten. Save you the trouble of trying to look at the fuzzy cursive. I've pulled out the text that matters to what we want to look at. And this is where they delineate the actual line that will be between the creeks and the United States. It says, beginning at the high shoals of the Appalachia, or the Appalachie, where the line of the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson touches the same. So essentially at the high shoals, the first treaty in 1802, the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson, came out of there and went straight down toward just outside of Milledgeville. That went straight through downtown Madison, what would become downtown Madison. That's the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson. So, beginning at the high shoals of the Appalachie, where the line of the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson touches the same, thence running in a straight line to the mouth of Ukafahatchee. It is being the first large branch of the fork of the Ocmulgee above the Seven Islands. A couple of those things should jump out to you. The Seven Islands, my poor pronunciation of Okafahatchee. I promised I practiced that. You'll more commonly know that river now by its current name, the Alcovy. But Seven Islands Road, that's the road that took you over the Seven Islands of the Ocmulgee. And they're saying, essentially, hey, for this line, we want it to go from the high shoals of the Appalachie all the way over to essentially the mouth of the Alcovy, unless it strikes the Alcovy before then, at which point it will follow the meanders of the river down to the mouth. What I've done on the map background here, this is the 1896 Usgs Topographical Survey. This red line is that line. That is from the high shoals, taking you straight to the mouth of the Appalachie in that direction. When Newton County was created, they kind of bent right in here. You can kind of see right where that marker is, how that was carved down into this. But originally, this is Morgan, and then this blue line would have delineated us from Jasper County on the other side. This was the original 1805 line, commonly referred to at the time as the dry line. It was one of the first treaties that did not necessarily follow a river the whole way. So the dividing line was often called the dry line because it did not actually fall on any particular river. This is just another look. This is from the Library of Congress. This is a map of Indian treaties, kind of color-coded, but to give you an idea, here's the high shoals, here's the high tower path, the Etowah Trail. You see there it loops around to one of the shallow fords and goes down this way. Here's the Chattahoochee. This area up in here would have been the only Cherokee area represented on the map. This would have all been Muskogee coming out of the Mississippian period where they would emerge and essentially become the Creek Nation or the Creek Indians. So no Cherokees down here. This setup, they talk about 19th century in the report. They talk about the growing hostilities among Euro-American settlers and American Indians caused sporadic conflicts that soon erupted into open warfare. One such conflict was the Battle of Horseshoe Man on March 27, 1814, part of the Red Stick War, known as the Creek Civil War, in Alabama between the Creeks and the federal forces. They quote a 1982 book there. The war officially ended in 1814 when Muskogee Creek was forced to cede much of southern Georgia and in additional lands. This is a gross understatement of that time period. Ever since the 1790s, there's constant conflict, and it's peaked and valleyed. It's kind of gone up and down. So yes, there were sporadic conflicts that would go into heated periods of war and then would drop down. They do a terrible job of calling out that Horseshoe Bend is actually kind of the conclusion of the Creek Civil War, which does start out, a couple of years earlier down in South Alabama, where traders, or essentially the British, are trying to get goods to the Red Stick Creeks so that they can kind of fight against the American forces, because Americans are engaged against Great Britain in the War of 1812 at the time. So your enemy's enemy is your friend. Doesn't make sense for the British to support Native Americans who are willing to fight against us. None of that's captured here. Now, behind that, you'll see this kind of script written with some dates, kind of some columns there. That is the roster Fort Defiance, which would have been on the Ravian Site, built by the governor of Georgia at this time. I have made these archaeological firms aware of the presence of the fort that was most likely within the Ravian Site, as well as Fort New Hope, which sat on the Jasper County side, and also we have a couple of these individual soldiers' pensions, where they talk about serving and fighting, or serving and building the forts along the dry line, that 1805 treaty line. None of that's called out in here. It really should be. It helps add to the understanding of the area. Further on, they talk about the Georgia Railroad coming through the area. Again, they quote just kind of a couple of basic books to give a tidbit about it. Nowhere do they call out the blue map you see here. That's a railroad valuation map. Those are highly detailed, show property lines, can really help contextualize and tell the story of the area. If they're trying to talk about historical significance, these maps are easily accessible in the National Archives, Washington, D.C., and I don't know why we're not trying to pull those in to help to understand some of this stuff. I'll call out here Sam's. You see Sam's quoted in 1967. I just like to say, if you go back and listen to my other video where I talk about what to expect from a cultural historical survey, you'll specifically hear me reference Wayfarers and Walton. Every time you see Sam's in here, 1967, Anita B. Sams wrote Wayfarers and Walton, which is essentially just a gathering of local stories as she tries to put together the story of Walton County. And what this study has done is just reach into this collection of stories and pull that out as a secondary source to use as a resource to say this is what happens because Anita B. Sams put this on her book, Wayfarers and Walton. That's a secondary source. That's not a primary source. And we've already shown that in the previous slides, it's her that is quoted about the Cherokee Trail coming through a social circle in Creek Indian territory. So we've already got our antennas up knowing that that secondary source may not be completely accurate. They talk about the racial tensions. They do call out the lynching that happened on Moore's Ford on the bridge that was there. One of the things that I think they've completely left on the table is the ex-slave narratives. The WPA did a bunch of work in the 1930s where they interviewed a number of people, and that could have been easily made part of this and would provide a huge contextual understanding of this land. Just to give you an example how simple it is, here is available online the typed transcript of these interviews. And here's Alec Bostwick of Morgan County, of Bostwick town fame, a slave that was in that area. You know, fair warning, terminology that is used there is not what we consider appropriate today, but this was a recorded interview from the 30s. And so you'll see there's hundreds of those interviews available online, many of which mention Morgan County and surrounding towns, Walton County, Social Circle, Covington, all these areas are called out in here. Would have really added to the cultural diverse understanding of this report, but alas, they weren't included. Now, they do call out that of the 10 previous recorded archaeological sites with a 20th century component, that there's 10 of those located within 1 kilometer of the project area. They then delineate those down to say 5 of them are home sites, 2 historic period kind of artifact scatters. Sometimes you'll hear them talk about lithic scatters, which is just kind of pottery and things like that. A farm, 1 cemetery, a historic bridge abutment, and they say aside from the cemetery, which was recommended as eligible for the National Register of Historic Places under Criteria A and Criteria D, all these areas have been recommended as ineligible to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about what that criteria looks like. A criteria for evaluation when it comes to looking at is something worthy of being on the National Register of Historic Places essentially falls into 4 categories. You've got A, that they are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to broad patterns of our history. So it could be something unique like Independence Hall, Philadelphia, or they mention that the cemetery could be classified under A, that it's made a significant contribution to a broad pattern of our history. And what they're saying there is this African American burial ground, which doesn't have good marked stones, is probably very common and represents what we'd expect to see from poor people in the area. Item B is these are associated with the lives of significant persons in or the past. Criteria B would be something like Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. It's associated with a significant person. Significance C, they embody the distinct characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represent the work of a master, or that possesses a highly artistic value, represent a significant or distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. This would be sort of unique buildings. You think about some of the buildings in downtown Madison. Those could be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places based on the distinctive characteristics, the type, the period that they come from, the fact they're still standing from that period. Those are things that would fall into an eligibility in C. Or D, that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. Now, they say the slave cemetery is also eligible, or African American cemetery. We don't know if it was slave, or free blacks, what it may have been. We just know that that was the area, the time frame. We say this has yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. So clearly that cemetery could tell us more just by preserving it. But they do call out that a number of these other places are ineligible. They would not recommend those for National Register. Again, let's take a look. Kind of the background picture that I have is the 1896 topo map. The inset you see here is that same map, but with the area that this particular study is concerned with, and that is the I-20 corridor, which you can see runs right along this line. And then here's 278 as it comes across. You can see kind of the Y shape here where the road splits off and follows the old road, but now 278 comes this direction and comes up here to kind of where Unity Store is, and of course down the Academy Road and back that direction. But it's just this area that they're concerned with as far as what was looked at for this particular study. Here's the list of the sites that were previously recorded within 1 kilometer of the survey area. Again, here is the possible African American cemetery. They say that could be eligible under items A or D. Now, notice the heading of this, the National Register of Historic Places recommendation. And then they go on to make recommendations based on what they've seen, saying, oh, it's ineligible, should not be included. That's their thoughts when you see ineligible. When they say unknown, they're essentially saying, I don't know, it could be, it could not be, we just don't have enough information to determine that. So one spot that they say, yes, it's eligible, the rest of them, they make a determination. It says, no, this is not worth it. Or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. These range from lithic scatter, which again could be pottery, odd things like that. They're in an area, house site, historic scatter, which would be more processed goods, buttons, things like that that may be found that are not necessarily a lithic. To kind of blow that area up, this is a 1 kilometer search area outside of the actual survey area. And these little dots are historic places previously identified either by that lithic scatter, as one of those cemeteries, as an old home site. So within 1 kilometer of this very small search area, there's at least 10 other sites that held some type of historic value. And in the report creator's judgment, only one of those is deemed worthy of retaining. So, be that as it may, that's kind of what you're looking at. Within their uh, within their report, they're required to talk about, is this, what do we expect and what methods will we use? So based on, it says here, based on the environmental, cultural, historic context provided in this chapter, it's anticipated that the potential exists for encountering archaeological resources during the survey. It says, hey, there's potential we'll find something. The probability of encountering resources of various types is based entirely on factors known prior to field investigations. So just based on the little bit of background they have, they expect to find something. Um, they'll talk about prior to field work what they expect to see. Now, one of the things that I will say here is literature and record search when they talk about their methods. They spend a good bit of time talking about the map resources that they use to kind of help build the lay of the land. So they're looking at previous archaeological work done, and they're looking at various types of maps, topographic resources, cartographic resources to put things together. At the very end, they looked at published historical and secondary sources uh, to help understand the history of the survey area. That they didn't do any primary research to validate or to help understand, or interview any locals really prior to this with in-depth notes. They simply copied some notes out of the Wayfarers of Walton or something like that, to try to make a historical understanding of the site. Essentially, the process they used is they gridded out that entire area and they dug shovel holes every so often. I talked about shovel tests in the prior video I did. Of those holes, they did 1,437 tests. Of those, 1,412 were negative, meaning they found nothing other than just regular dirt and debris in the holes. Debris like, organic matter. 12 of those were positive, and 13 of the locations could not be excavated due to impediments such as concrete, water, and stuff. So, talks about that of all those, at least 12 of them came back with something. Then it talks about, some of these areas had, more struggle or less struggle. They could get into some, that some of the areas have been developed already or bulldozed over. It just made it hard to dig. In talking about the African American cemetery, they go on to talk a little bit about some of the rubble piles that are there. And it says, we recommend the cemetery may be eligible for National Register of Historic Places under Criteria D, as it falls in the category of considerations D as a cemetery that derives its primary significance from its association with historic events. Accordingly, additional work was recommended to clarify the site's eligibility. So right here they say you should learn more about this site. You should do more research there. We'll probably see similar statements made when they do the cultural site survey on the Ravian site. That line right there says you need to do more work, which means we should really raise our ears and see if they're going to actually do more work there. One of the things I'll say is, hey, did they really search land records? No, they just told us that, hey, I looked at um, secondary resources. They didn't look at the slave collections, any of the slave narratives recorded in the WPA work. Didn't see any of the Georgia newspapers quoted or referenced in here from that time frame. Those things could really help tell the story of this African American cemetery, and none of those seem to be quoted. They did mention that they had interviewed somebody, and that's just kind of family lore and what they heard. A good researcher can take that and do a little bit more with it rather than just say, we heard a rumor. Give an example of just how one of these things could look, and these little dots. So here's that dotted line that outlines the edge of the site survey. So this is the area they're supposed to be testing, and they essentially go across and make a grid pattern, and each one of these holes represent a place where they took a shovel and they dug down to see if they found anything. If it's, kind of like most of these are, that's a negative test. You'll see there's an area that was indicated as flooded, so they probably didn't get much there. This was a previously known site along with its boundaries, and they call out a possible grave where there's a headstone, things like that, and then they can go on and kind of expand on those a little bit further. This is another known site. I pulled this one and showed you in particular because this site was known. It was recorded before, probably had some type of thing that said, hey, it's ineligible because for whatever reason we don't think it meets the criteria. Okay to work over it. And so this is what it looks like afterwards. That there's your high tensile transmission line, grading roads going back to industry, that we just flattened everything out. We said nothing in here is important. So all it takes is somebody to deem something kind of ineligible for recommendation, and they can go right over the top of it and push it out of the way. Again, just to give you an image, here is what a known site would look like. You can see they've had to extend the boundary. The known site was originally kind of in this circle, what was previously recorded, and as they did their shovel test, you notice the darker circles here indicate a positive shovel test. Along this line, they found additional items coming outside of this, which meant they now had to expand the boundaries of the previously known site to extend that a little bit further. So those are things to be on the lookout for. Give a sample of some lithic ceramic type stuff that were found in this particular study is essentially sand tempered clay, probably was pots or something like that. What I'll call out, this one's a little bit too small to understand anything. You'll see that their names, Cartersville, simple stamped, Keith incised, unclassified. Cartersville, Keith, Lamar, when you hear things like that, those are speaking to particular types or periods of pottery. This is incised because it's cut. You can see there's a design that was placed in that one. This one you can see a little bit of ridges through here. That was a style of pottery coming out of the Mississippian that went through the Muskogee Creek, where they would make their pots and then use a wooden paddle with some type of pattern on it, and that they would stamp that on the outside to decorate the pots to an extent. So that is a pot that is, 1,000 years old, maybe, that we're looking at that somebody used and did. So pretty neat little find. Again, that was not included. That was a spot wherever that was found that they said, probably not eligible. Don't need to worry about saving that. Here's another example of a home site, one of the previous homes that they knew was in the area. Here's the boundary of it, and they went in here and did some digging. Of course, probably found some modern day stuff. What I will call out is that this is the 1939 overhead of the same area. The previous picture was from 1970 overhead of the area. They did not include any of the other photos in the report as far as historical overall areas, and these slides are in the possession, most of them UGA, so they're just up the road if somebody actually wanted to go physically look at the slide film and see the pictures. Another example of some things that they did note back there. Here's some columns that used to have stucco on top of them, one of those home places. And this is essentially a quartz projectile point. You'll commonly hear this called an arrowhead. you cannot necessarily say that that's an arrowhead. I'll just say you'll see a lot of times that they'll give the more descriptive Native American classification names with these things. This could be the best way to kind of generalize this is to call it a projectile point, because it could have been an arrowhead, it could have been a spear point, it could have been the point on an atlatl. Most likely, you see this one started a flute in the back, and it doesn't seem to ever be finished. Probably what happened is the Native American that was crafting this didn't like the way the quartz was starting to turn out as they were chipping it to get the point, and they just put it down and moved on to another piece of rock that worked better for their purposes. Here's a couple of things that I'll call out from this report. It says, as the site has been heavily damaged from the recent construction of a utility corridor and electrical facilities, it no longer retains integrity. The recovered assemblage is modest and was recovered from a distributed context, and an additional work is unlikely to yield significant archaeological data. EP recommends that the unknown portion of the site be designated as an ESA and protected by OBF during construction. What they're saying is, hey, one of these sites that they're describing here, we found some stuff there. Probably was significant, but it's been damaged by construction, moving of dirt, things that were built, everything's scattered. Best we can say is try to put a fence up around it so that maybe we can come back at it later and look at it, but we're never going to find anything. It's been so run over. Now, I'll call out in the survey expectations, they go on to talk a little bit more about the probability of looking at pre-contact sites or woodland or Mississippian period sites, as well as the historic period. And they conclude by saying, therefore, the probability of encountering historic period sites was considered to be very high. So they knew they would find historic period stuff, essentially kind of 1500 on. They knew that they'd be finding things. Some research questions. They talk about the fact that this land lies kind of on the dividing line between the drainage of the Ocmulgee and the Oconee, and that kind of commonly in some of the earlier Native American periods, people seem to live in the river bottoms or near creeks. But thanks to some of the work done at Reynolds Plantation and other places, they've determined that oftentimes they could be found on higher, flatter ground, and that this area in particular may show Native American presence in between stream heads on higher ground because of the ability to move between a couple of different river basins. So I think that just plays right into our hands for things we should look at during the Ravian project, because that would lay on the higher ground between the drainages of the Ocmulgee and the Oconee. When glancing at the appendix and the references, I'll call out a couple of things. Talked about Anita B. Sams, her 1967 book, Wayfarers in Walton, History of Walton County. Essentially, she went around and grabbed as many stories and odd and end things she could and put them in a book and called it Wayfarers of Walton, the History of Walton County. A lot of that not necessarily substantiated. That's not a knock against her or her research, but it's just, it's a collection that needs to be validated before it's used in an archaeological context to develop a true history. The second one is really just a shout out to my family. Dorsey Stansel is my uncle, and rest in peace, but so glad to see that some of his work is still being used. So I come by this passion honestly. One of the last things I'll call out is in this 2004 work, Historical Archaeology in Georgia. And I'll point out that Catherine S. Long has actually done work on 1812 period forts, of which Fort Defiance in the Ravian Site area, Fort New Hope, which would have been Jasper County, possibly near one of these sites, of that same time period of which Catherine Long has done work in those areas. So they reference somebody who could have been an excellent resource if they just picked up the phone. Let's take a look at the Ravian site while we're here talking about it. This, of course, is what Ravian has put out there. Keep in mind what we just looked at was just this one little area kind of right in through here. We saw that work ended up being 100 and some odd pages, and appendix included just to cover 12 positive shovel tests in that little area. Now think about what we should be seeing from a cultural site survey all through here, which would have covered a couple of creek crossings, a couple of spring heads. I've already mentioned in the past a fort that was probably located right along the high line in through here. Who knows what other cemeteries, home sites may be in there and be found. So things we need to be looking out for. So just a quick glance. If you want to go out there and poke around, do any searching, these are places that are easily accessible online. They've digitized a lot of things in National Archives and Library of Congress. A lot of robust material. It'll take you a while to dig through. USGS Historical Topographical Map Explorer. The map you see in the background was taken right from that. What they have done an excellent job of is layering on all the previous topo maps into one unified thing so that you can go on there and pull topo maps from anywhere in the U.S. at any time frame when it was created. The Special Libraries Collection at the University of Georgia has a ton of things, including some of the fort plans from the 1813 time frame, as well as documents interviews with Native Americans from this time period, including actions that happened, the Battle of Jack's Creek, as well as kind of down below Hard Labor and Big Sandy Creek, where they tie into the Appalachia on the Morgan County side. There was an ambush in that area. A couple of U.S. militiamen were killed fighting the Creeks. There's all sorts of things like that available in there. And the State Archives at Morrow, Georgia, which is where I've pulled some of the documents that I've shared previously about the area. So those things, a lot of them have them online. The State Archives you have to visit in person because they just don't have the staff to necessarily scan a bunch of things. But hopefully you find this useful. Just an overview of one piece of the big pie that we're looking at here, and this is just for that one little US 278 I-20 interchange. Hope you found that useful. Have any questions, please shoot me an email. You can go to my website, gwinettrambler.com, and reach out to me anytime. Eli Stansel, appreciate you paying it in.
Hey, hope you enjoyed the video. If you see fit to helping us out, please follow the links down below and assist us with Morgan County land, sky, and water. Let's take care of our land.